What up, everybody? It's Joe, better known as GoodLawgic. You're watching Attorney Reacts. I'm a New York attorney. That means it's my job to start reacting. Today's video is not a drive-by shooting. Before I can begin this video, I need to give some of you some context for what we're about to see. This is testimony of Sergeant Christopher Williams from the double murder trial of YNW Melly and YNW Bortland, who are accused of killing YNW Sack Chaser and YNW Juvie. From now on, I'm going to cut out the YNWs because it just makes it more confusing. According to the state, Melly and Bortland conspired to kill the two victims while they were sitting in their car. Melly and Bortland defend by claiming that Juvie and Sack Chaser were killed via a drive-by shooting. We're about to see the officer testify here as to why it is that he believes that this could not have resulted from a drive-by shooting. Let's go.
So this resting angle in this seat, you have the projectile coming in, exiting through the top of the skull, and then continuing through the windshield.
You said windshield.
The window.
Can you say that it was at the top of the window, or the bottom of the window, the middle of the window?
I cannot.
So
you can see he's going all Dexter there, trying to lay out exactly how the blood was spattering out. And it's spatter, not splatter. I don't want to hear splatter.
Based on that projectile and the blowback, you can make what opinions?
So based on the angle of this projectile, the blowback is indicative of a firearm being in close vicinity of the head. The head is something that bleeds profusely when it's pierced. If you've ever fallen on stairs or hit your head, it bleeds like no tomorrow.
Now, this sort of testimony at a murder trial is very compelling, particularly when there are no witnesses, because there's an old phrase, which is blood don't lie. You might have heard a ball don't lie. That could be true. But one thing is definitely true, and that is blood don't lie. Now, it could be misinterpreted, but it certainly don't lie.
And because the projectile entered in right below the skull, the blowback ended up coming in the direction of, as I was speaking earlier about the hose, in the direction that it came from. And you will get that with a very close shot. That blowback then proceeded after the shot. It went up, it hit this headliner, and continued and falling into the back seat.
And so I want to go to some of the other photos. There's a yellow jacket that's on the very back.
And again, I want to be clear. It's true, blood don't lie. But we will frequently see that experts will see the same blood spatter and come to different results. That's what I mean, that it can be misinterpreted. Now, he's saying that based on how we see the blood fell here, it's apparent that the shots came from within the vehicle rather than coming from outside the vehicle, because in his estimation, it never would have shot up in the way that it did had the shots come from outside the car.
Of the vehicle. Is it important to know whose DNA and blood was found on that?
What yellow jacket?
Let me come back to the other photos, so we'll come back to that in a moment.
Whoops.
Okay, so in terms of the location of the firearm that fired the shot, and we were just talking about in CSW 6745, does this attempt to accurately recreate the potential location of that firearm?
So the purpose of this photograph is strictly demonstrative to show where once the projectile enters into the head, you're going to have the blowback.
Personally, I have a lot of issues, as do many other attorneys, with what we call demonstrative aids, because demonstrative aids are not evidence. Evidence are things that we know came from the scene of the crime, or it's depicting the way things looked precisely in that moment, not altered or tailored or enhanced in any sort of way. That makes it not actual evidence, but it can be used for demonstrative purposes, just to demonstrate to the jury what the party who's bringing that demonstrative aid believes it may have looked like at the time that the subject events occurred. And a demonstrative aid can be very powerful, and perhaps wrongly so, because it's not actual evidence. It's really just a recreation. And if there's no video evidence, that is the only image that they're going to get as to how things occurred. And that can be a very powerful seed to plant in the minds of the jury, which may be completely inaccurate. It may have nothing to do with how things actually looked in the moment, but since this is the only thing they're ever going to see, it ends up having a very powerful role in the way they interpret how events occurred. And for that reason, it can be somewhat prejudicial, but many attorneys get away with it, both for the state and for defense, as well as in civil cases.
Which again will come up, strike the headliner, and then continue. It's actually continuing this way and landing back here behind it.
And look at how he's drawing the picture here in order to help strengthen and bolster his own testimony in a proper way, saying the reason I came to my conclusion is because you see that scuff mark at the top of the arc there? That scuff mark is indicative of how it struck up there and came back down, and we can sort of see in the jury, okay, now I understand why you came to the conclusion. I see the same thing you're seeing, and you're explaining to me how we should interpret it. And that's why expert witness like this can be very powerful and influential with the jury.
The driver in this area of the vehicle.
In terms of the driver and the t-shirt that he was wearing, do you take into account the location of the victim's DNA on his shirt?
Well, based upon the blowback pattern up here, I would expect to find some blowback here if on a driver, if a driver was there.
Okay, Sergeant, you can answer
Okay, we're going full Dexter now. Full Dexter.
that question.
Why don't you restate the question?
So you were discussing that how you would find and determine angles and ranges for specific individuals that are presented to you.
Yes.
How would you do that?
So I would obtain a shooting height, a maximum, what we would determine as a maximum shooting height, which would be standing with your arm out at 90 degrees. That height would be obtained from the ground to your arm, to your finger essentially. And then a minimum shooting height, which would be squatting with the same arm out and measurement from here to your finger. And then the
reason they talk about like minimum shooting heights and other shooting heights is because whenever you're dealing with an angle, the way you're dealing with these shots being fired, well, the further away the gun is, if it's an angle downward, the further away you come from where the bullet struck, the higher the gun had to be at the moment of the shot. If we're not sure exactly what the distance is between the rifle barrel and the spot where the bullet impacts, that could change dramatically the height of the gun at the moment that the trigger is being pulled.
Real quick, I just wanted to say that Attorney Tom/Attorney Reacts content is now on Spotify. We just launched a partnered show, link in the description. Go check it out. Now, back to the video.
that would give me a minimum and a maximum range of fire. Once I have a minimum and maximum range of fire, that gets added into more trig to determine a minimum and maximum distance of that particular shooter.
So with regards to this incident, were you there on scene?
No,
Do you know who fired the shots?
no.
In terms of the shots to the outside,
And that's really not a problem because he's not testifying that I know who fired. I'm just telling you that we can determine where the shooter had to be without necessarily identifying who it was.
of the vehicle, are you aware that individuals already dead when those were fired?
They were already dead, yes.
Objection, Your Honor.
How does that play into your reconstruction?
Yeah, I like that objection there because in order to determine that, you would think that he needs to have some sort of knowledge about human physiology. Let's hear what he says.
It comes into play because specifically with Christopher Thomas, because Christopher Thomas was already deceased when these rounds were coming into the back of the vehicle, because Christopher Thomas was what we would call crumbling. He was starting to fall, if you will. And on top of that, I know that he was already deceased because the back of his back, essentially, the rounds that are in his back have no blood in them, which means that there's no circulation. So the rounds are coming in. Christopher Thomas is crumbling with each round. He's falling with each.
That seems to be a medical determination that I'm not sure would be within the purview of a detective? Perhaps could be. I suspect that that's why the defense counsel raised an objection. Really depends on what type of training he has and how he's been qualified. This seems like he's giving some level of expert testimony. So presumably he was qualified on some level, but he's expressing a great deal of opinion here, which is the role of an expert witness as opposed to any other type of witness. So the question is the nature of how he's qualified. When an expert is qualified, they go through a lengthy voir dire, lengthy questioning frequently, which will lay down the background as to how they have knowledge and expertise in a particular area. Well, you can lay down foundation that you have expertise in area A, but that doesn't mean you have expertise in areas B, C, D, E, which all might be in the crime field, but that's just not your specialty. And if you haven't laid sufficient foundation to establish that you're an expert and be qualified by the court as having that qualification of being an expert, you don't have jurisdiction to issue an opinion on those issues. He seems to be covering the gamut here. He's talking about where the blood spatter is going. He's talking about angles of where the gunshots are coming. These seem to be related, but somewhat different areas of expertise. Now he's talking about how blood flow works with respect to the blood on the back of the shirt. These are a lot of different areas. He's covering a lot of ground here, a lot of ground. He seems to be a jack of all trades. So I don't know what type of qualification the judge gave when he qualified him as an expert. This seems to be pretty broad.
Each round, and that's the answer.
Okay. So in terms of, we'll get to the shooting inside the car in a little bit. I want to stick to the outside at this point. When you were looking at the side of the car on the angles of entry and the side-to-side angles that I'm talking about, why is that important in your analysis? I'm going to go back to 4809 to describe those angles.
So these angles are important because it is part of my assignment, which is to determine if this is a drive-by shooting. And my determination was that this is not a drive-by shooting, and it's based upon this picture here, which is a very good picture to describe it. All of these rounds are done, and all but one is done at a stationary position. The shooter is at a stationary position when all but one of these rounds are going in. The one round that has some movement in it, which is round site L here, the shooter is actually moving in that to create the little bit of a keyhole that you see there.
Okay. A lot of information in that answer, so let's break it
Yeah,
down.
that is a lot of information. We need to
You
unpack that.
mentioned a keyhole, so I'm going to zoom in on site L and explain what is a keyhole.
So a keyhole is a projectile comes out of the barrel and it is actually spinning in a line. It's also falling as it spins. However, once you add movement to the gun at the same time the projectile is coming out, you introduce that movement to the projectile. Once the projectile has altered movement, it will start to tumble. So it's no longer going in a straight line. It is actually going like head over feet, if you will, as it's entering into its target. And that head over feet gives you this right here, which is essentially the projectile coming in sideways.
And in terms of a drive-by shooting, if two vehicles were moving at 45 miles per hour, what would you expect to see?
So if it's a drive-by shooting, all of these rounds should look like this.
Why?
Because movement is being introduced to that projectile.
So to contrast site L with one of the other sites like U, what does that tell you?
So that's a shot that the shooter is stationary. The vehicle is stationary.
Well, that last visual there seems pretty compelling as far as indicating that the cars could not have been in motion, driving parallel to each other while this shooting was occurring. And you would think that that would be somewhat damning for the defendants. And this witness covered a broad array of evidence in order to establish that there are multiple reasons to not believe that this was a drive-by shooting. Both started with the blood spatter indicating that the shot had to come from within the vehicle. You have the spray of bullets there. You also have the shots going into the body of one of the victims while it was crumbling and not bleeding, implying that he was already shot after he was already dead in what presumably, in the eyes of the state, was an attempted cover-up by defendants as they shot up the side of their own car after killing their victims. And then you have this final shot here of a square-on shot, which implies that it could not have been made from a shooter who was in motion. That's a lot of different ways that the state tried to use this witness in order to establish that the defendant's claim of it being a drive-by shooting does not fit with the forensic evidence. But I want to caution you, when you watch a video like this, you can understand why a lot of people would come away from it saying like, wow, they're definitely guilty. How is it that they could ever get a hung jury, which is what they ended up getting? And the answer to that question is frequently that until you see the cross-examination, you see the rest of the evidence. And a frequent answer to that question is that unless you see the cross-examination, a common answer to that question is that if you watch the witness start to crumble under cross-examination, you can see how a lot of times defense counsel can be very effective in properly pulling at different threads of testimony that came out on direct, which can really undo a lot of the narrative that you watch when you get a condensed video like this. But I'm curious about your thoughts. Do you think that this was compelling evidence that Melly and Bortland must have murdered their compatriots? Or do you think that there's still a lot left to be determined? Drop a comment down below. Let me know what you think. I try to read all the comments. And if you're stuck here this long, please make sure that you like, subscribe to the channel, check me out. I'm GoodLawgic. I'm out of here. Godspeed.
Big verdict.